Can you actually tell us how to go about building topical authority correctly?
Sure. So you will start with figuring out what is your source context, exactly what are you selling. Based off of that, you will have a kind of, let's say, an object, which essentially is an entity, or maybe it could be a group of objects in case, let's say, you have an e-commerce store and you're selling lots of products. So that's no longer a single thing that you're focused on, but it could be a kind of combination of them. Ideal scenario is that if you're able to group them in a kind of very clearly representative type of way. So let's say, if we're talking about snowboarding or things like that, you can focus on everything related to snowboarding, including just snowboarding gear. It's, let's say, like helmets, gloves, pants, different safety gear for the knees, elbows, etc. And of course, the snowboards themselves. At the same time, you can also focus on just a single thing in itself. If I give a let's say, separate example, if you focus on, let's say, just the word skateboard, that becomes essentially your main product that you're focused on. The next part over here, when you realize precisely what you're selling or what's the range of the things that you're selling, try to, it's a little bit more technical, but it's very good to understand index construction in terms of how does Google actually create different indices and what is, let's say, a real index or what is a merged index. Essentially, not really existing one. There's just lots of different things combined from other indices. What this does, in what I'm talking about here, is essentially within that sphere, within that specific part that we try to enter, that part is also split into micro subparts. And we need to navigate and find precisely which things, which queries have a dedicated spot within Google's attention, let's say. That's where we want to go in and start competing. We don't want to go into essentially a piece that doesn't exist where in Google's mind, where it doesn't really pay attention. This mostly comes from search demands and in some cases document statistics and certain, let's say, behaviors of documents on the web in general. But for the simplicity's sake, you can try to understand the search volumes, and then the next part is the actually semantic search, because indices usually would be built either for the entity itself or the entity and attribute pairs. In some cases, it could be built for certain templates. I think one of the most known templates is the how-to. So it's how to do something, let's say how to repair, how to fix, how to draw, etc. Then I would say try to find all of your competitors, even that you think are maybe slightly remote ones, or maybe not even your competitors. Analyze their sitemaps, analyze their title tags, try to understand what entities they try to focus on, what exactly do they process. If you can, let's say, evaluate the content in terms of how deep and how deep they process it and how often they, let's say, refresh it or how well they maintain it. This can give you certain signals in terms of where there potentially could be more commercial activity, or there could be a slightly higher competition in terms of sites constantly keep everything refreshed on those levels. This helps you navigate and understand so far what all of your competition has covered. Ideally, if you're an expert in your own niche and you actually understand all of the, let's say, your knowledge domain related terms and topics. Many times, if, let's say, just an SEO does a kind of campaign, they will mostly follow queries. They'll also follow competitors in this type of way. And many times they actually miss lots of different really important queries that belong to that specific micro part of the sphere. But because it didn't appear in the queries, or these were the queries that were harder to find, they will just miss that. So this is a big advantage point of working with the actual experts in the industry, because they can help you enrich your overall content network that you will process in the later stages. And so from this part, once you see a clear picture what your competitors have done, what you will be doing. I think it will be, let's say, a very positive scenario where you can see that your competitors are either outdated or they have completely missed certain points within the information that they present. That should be a more positive sign for you to, let's say, be more excited to go and perform the campaign, because essentially these are easier scenarios to deal with. And from over here, it's time to design the actual, let's say, briefs for every single article. Slightly before that, it's important to understand the index construction, to understand what should we process on which page. In a scenario where, let's say, we have a really important thing we need to explain about engines, but we can see that there's no specific separate demands, there's no queries that are asking something like that. We still need to find where we can integrate this piece of information within the sort of safe indices or indexes that exist, to not create problems for ourselves and sort of to minimize the overall size of contents that we try to present to Google, but still keeping it dense and information rich. A small visual scenario over here. If you try to, let's say, draw an actual knowledge graph where you, let's say, on an example with cars, a very simple scenario. Imagine you're drawing dots on a chalkboard and you're trying to connect all of the dots with a line. So if we need to explain what is a car, we will probably talk about things like its engine, we'll talk about suspension, we'll talk about wheels, the driving wheel, seats, right? Imagine that how many things exist in the car. Every single one of those things is a dot. You need to cover all of these dots and connect them to each other. And that's what actually completes the explanation of a word like a car. Of course, in different domains, there are different these types of concepts. And so, as we evaluated competitors, now we have a very clear plan for what we will be doing. It's time to align things to see that, let's say, maybe competitors opened 5 different pages for essentially the same object. And maybe that's a very wrong thing to do. So that's where we can easily win by just basically compressing the information into just a single page and making it way more digestible for Google. They just need to process one page where everything is already covered, instead of trying to maintain and refresh and recrawl different pages. So the biggest hint here is really studying the principles of index construction. That really helps solve, I would say, like almost 80% of these types of questions or problems.
Okay, so how actually do you figure out the correct topical radius, meaning how far from the topic can you go before you get hurt?
I should mention that, first of all, it starts with actually getting experience. So it's a little bit about doing it and kind of feeling it throughout the process, and then realizing that meaning-wise, we're actually shifting a little bit too far away. A very important in the mechanism why this happens is whenever you create briefs, you try to stick to a single entity or entity attribute pair, or a template, or specific types of contexts. If you remember what we mentioned earlier, that's exactly how Google builds or constructs their indices. So there is exactly that type of match that happens here. And then you realize that if you try to, let's say, because you need to connect all of these things to each other, when, let's say, we have that object of a car that we work with, and then, let's say, for a funny thing, for some reason we want to talk about bananas, in a logical order of questions, you would need to add a lot of things in between before you can start, let's say, asking with something like, banana related to the car or things like that, or even prioritizing the word banana and then using the word car as something sequential or consequential. There are always ways to integrate different things, but it's much more important what do we precisely focus on. Because if we do put the focus on like imagine on that map of dots where everything is interconnected, for some reason a word like, let's say, apple or banana appears. How the hell are we going to connect everything related to, let's say, engines and their types and the types of fuels that are being used and different mileage, things to the fruit? We really need to ask lots and lots and lots of things in between to make that kind of connection. And the more questions you need in between, the longer is that meaningful distance. You can realize it is kind of like a common sense thing. And another tip I can give here is just remind yourself of your source context. Because if you know you're not selling that, that already signals that this is really not that important. Okay. But if that object or thing, or let's say a template or a pattern or something like that, if it helps you explain the other things around your core entities that you focused on, that is still a good thing, because there is a kind of ladder type of connection, because they're really, let's say, precisely close. What I mean here, for example, if you deal with, let's say, music studio or music equipment, it is not hurtful for you. It is very beneficial for you to explain how audio waves work and how the air moves, because that directly then shows, I assume, I'm not an expert in these audio equipments, but things like decibels and different types of equipments will be probably highly responsive to these things. So these are intertwined domains or intertwined points of information, and a lot of them are assumed. If you're explaining about the sensitivity of microphone, let's say it captures voice really well, but what is voice? Voice is a sound wave. That's why if you explain sound waves and different working principles behind them, it all helps you prove that you actually know what you're talking about. And another simple thing here, think of it like this. Imagine you would go to a mechanic, and then before working with them, you're actually gonna ask them like 100 different questions. And you realize that your mechanic is not able to tell you the difference between different types of engines or between different types of fuels, or let's say gasoline versus diesel and these types of things. So on the information or knowledge level, you would feel very not confident in them. Yes, they are dressed as a mechanic, but maybe you cannot really trust them if they couldn't explain, let's say, everything about your brand model of your car or different types of common issues that happen with your car. If they cannot tell you that, you would trust them a lot less. But that's exactly how Google tries to understand your website, to see how much do you know. And if you really, really know all of your things in depth, and you show how everything operates, and you really, for the most part, you're actually showing it to the Googles and how they perceive the world and how they understand that. So if you have real expertise, you're able to explain everything in granular detail. And that's what Google tries to identify. And that's what they can assign, let's say, trust towards, or that's what they can say. There's an actual expert here, and this can be given more traffic because it looks like they know what they're talking about, just on the level of content that is presented. That makes sense?
Yes. So actually, how often should you adjust or update your topical map, and what are the criteria for doing that?
Sure. So if you're very actively working with the topical map and you already started processing it, I would recommend just trying to move, let's say, much quicker to complete it without really trying to break it or mess with it in the middle of the process of, let's say, processing it. However, whenever you face different things with algorithm changes, let's say different helpful updates or core updates, and you can see that the most important part, some indices have shifted or changed, if you have made your plans according to those old index structures, but now they have changed, that means you are essentially executing a campaign for the outdated information. That's where you need to refresh. You need to be careful and aware of, essentially, it's all about Google's perception of, again, the world and what is being needed, what is being requested. And then you kind of play into these sort of play fields or kind of boxes that exist. When they shift, you need to adjust as well. Another part is not necessarily so much about the topical map, but it can slightly create a similar, there's a similar effect there. But in general, it's good to refresh your content. To be very honest, the more, the better. It's a little bit also about understanding the actual virality or popularity of certain topics and different trends that can occur. If you created an article about a trendy thing, but tomorrow it changed, you can become outdated just like that in 24 hours. But in general, try to refresh things at least every 6 months. By that point, you'll have enough Search Console data to see what has been actually happening in terms of where you have hit or miss for landing into these specific indices. But also you'll have hopefully a better understanding of your niche overall in terms of where there's more activity and where you can, let's say, sort of be a little bit more proactive in always staying updated or having like a fully completed set of information that you present.
And why some competitors fake queries?
Let me ask you, what do you mean by faking queries?
Like these are queries with no real traffic.
And do you mean that they write for these queries, or do you mean? So I assume we're looking at different kind of publicly available tools to see if there is a kind of search demand there or not. The point is that these tools are not really accurate enough to be very sort of deterministic and rely on it fully. In some cases, let's say the most optimistic scenario is if there is an actual expert behind that project and they know their niche really well. And the most important part, they know the client base very well. And they can look at a kind of a tool report and it will say that nobody's searching for this. But when these clients show up in the office, they're all asking that. So a person knows that this actually audience always seeking these types of answers, which is why usually the way it happens, they're just tired of explaining it. So they'll write an article about it and then say like, look, I have this thing to show, or if you really want to learn about it, everything is already explained over there. So that's kind of the most optimistic, the most, let's say, positive and nice scenario where that happens. Lots of other cases can be where there could be a kind of, let's say, outdated type of approach to SEO when it comes to just traditional search. What SEOs will do, they'll just basically go find all the queries that exist, even spot the ones that have no search volume at all. But because they are focused on essentially writing about everything that exists within the queries, they'll just write about it, not caring if there are searches or not. And it's a little bit like a hit and miss type of scenario. But yeah, the tricky part with all of this is we need real world data. And this is, I think, one of the most fascinating parts about SEO in general. I think most SEOs actually forget that the searches, they come from real people. And the real people exist in the real world. And maybe the news have changed, maybe the trends have changed, maybe there is an innovation, maybe there are certain, let's say, economical changes or something else. And people's behavior can change to the point where they will search more or search less, which is why whenever you see a kind of a tool reporting, it tells you this is being searched, let's say 1,000 times a month, you know, that really must mean that there will be exactly 1,000 people. I'm saying, you know, of course, approximately, but around 1,000 people that will search this every single month. But that doesn't have to be like that. They might all go on a vacation, or they will all lose their phones magically, and nobody's gonna remember to search that. So remember, you're really dealing with people there. These keywords and that number next to it, it's just an approximation estimation. It's not the representation of the real world. It's a kind of rough guess. So that's where lots of these things can come from, actually.
Thank you so much for sharing all these semantic SEO hacks. If you enjoyed it, follow Pavel on Facebook and LinkedIn and subscribe and like. Thank you.
Thank you.